The Further Education of OverSoul 7 by Jane Roberts. Read by Martin John. Chapter 16. Jeffrey Boy's uneasiness grows, and Ram does a disappearing act. When I was finished with what you have read thus far, I stared at the manuscript, appalled beyond description. The characters in the book were discussing me, and quite objectively, with the oddest kind of sympathy for my predicament. This concern added to my anxiety beyond measure. The constant use of third-person references to me, he, this, or he, that, struck me with a sense of panic. If the analysis of my character hadn't been so acute, perhaps I wouldn't have been so bothered. But several passages that I reread described me with a loving detachment that I found most disconcerting. All of this represented some important alteration in the pattern of activity thus far, and I recognized this at the time only opaquely, afraid to follow the matter through for fear, I suppose, of where it might lead. But the shock went even deeper than the realization that the relationship between the manuscript and myself was changing. No matter what they were, or how the book was being written, OverSoul 7 and Cypress were fictional characters. Their criticism, even their awareness of my own existence, somehow upset the very foundations of all my beliefs. I found myself saying, "They have no right to do this, no right at all," before I realized the implications and the irony of my own remark. Intrusion enough. This weird book and its method of delivery. But I had begun to think that it might be good enough to publish, without, of course, giving any hint of the way it was produced. This made me wonder how many other manuscripts had been written in the same manner, with the authors smart enough to keep their mouths shut and cut out any passages that might give them away. But this added development, I took it almost like an insult, was a further intrusion in which unreality dared to comment upon life, where art refused to stay where it belonged, if this was art of a most particular nature, and began a concerted program of entry into normal reality. The characters were becoming real, turning on their creator, and daring to examine his abilities and characteristics. I looked at these latest developments in this way for some time, even though I realized that the premise wasn't acceptable to begin with, since to all intents and purposes I wasn't writing the book, but only taking down its dictation. Did that mean that whoever was originating it felt quite safe in dissecting my character, as I might feel in, say, examining the characteristics of a laboratory animal? As far as Will's near-disastrous motorcycle ride is concerned, of course I was somewhat anxious and carried along by the suspense, as anyone is, even when just reading such adventurous passages in any book. If I was relieved at the end, surely my reaction was no more than natural. In that regard, I am sure that my identification with will was over-exaggerated by Cyprus and Seven in those passages where they refer to it. It's highly unlikely that they know me better than I know myself, for example. Though we all have a few suicidal thoughts in our lives, I've been no more given to them than anyone else. In any case, whenever you read in education any references to myself, you can pretty well imagine my own invisible reactions. For one thing, while writing down the script, I had no way of retorting to any such passages, of explaining my thoughts, or, in short, of speaking back. I was only barely aware of what I was writing to start with, and didn't even realize that I was being mentioned until I read the material over. It was impossible for me to insert any comments into the script, even later. In the craziest fashion, my reactions didn't or wouldn't fit. My own sentences literally could not be inserted into the book itself. It was as if two different kinds of order were involved that could coexist, but not mix. This further added to my anger, of course. If they could insert themselves so smugly into my reality and arrange for me to write their book, then why couldn't I at least report my own reactions within the script itself? Since I obviously cannot, however, these notes are really my parallel statements, the other side or my side of their book or world, if you prefer. The one in which the laboratory animals keep their own reports. I am worried, will I end up bragging about how well I performed at the series of clever psychological mazes? And is that actually what I'm being led to do? Yet even laboratory animals are given incentives. So what reward am I being offered? What stimuli am I unconsciously reacting to? The question itself suddenly excited me so that I stopped writing for a moment, filled with anticipation. If I'm running a different kind of maze than laboratory animals, a multi-dimensional one, to coin one of education's terms, then, of course, the psychological rewards are being held out like the carrot before the horse. And that simple enough statements sound very much like Ram's agitated first conversation with me in connection with the experiments he suggested. Experiments, incidentally, that were never quite explained to me. But in any case, surely I'm being offered a boon of a kind. The opportunity of studying this bizarre experience from the inside, at first hand, in the most isolated laboratory of all, in a way, my own mind. I seem to be both subject and analyst, and thus in a position to study behavioral conditioning from a unique standpoint. For the first time, I see some kind of logic that I can understand in all of this. If I'm right, then each further intrusion of the book world into mine is actually the insertion of new stimulus to the laboratory situation. My reactions are being watched, then. Why didn't this occur to me before? Well, any number can play that game. So, tomorrow I won't write a line on the infernal manuscript, and I'll wait for their reactions. Am I being crafty, suitably clever, or in playing the game have I already lost the fine edges of sanity? Now I question whether or not sanity has fine edges. I do wish I knew some truly knowledgeable colleague, familiar with all kinds of psychology, with whom I could discuss what's happening. Actually, I'm beyond that point now. I don't really feel that anyone else can help me. At the same time, I'm afraid, sometimes at least, that I'll end up like a ram or worse. Even the prospect of being considered a mere fool is a terrible one to me, when I've been so used to considering my psychological stance impeccable. All of this concentrated thought must be wearing me out. I feel unusually tired and can hardly keep my eyes open. My fingers keep lingering over the typewriter keys as if uncertain whether or not to continue. As I wrote the last sentence, a knock came at the door. I was glad enough of the interruption and called, "Come in," expecting some student perhaps, or associate. Instead, to my surprise, there was Ram, standing in the hallway, grinning, with a cigarette in one hand and a drink in the other. I leaped to my feet. "What are you doing out of the sanatorium?" I sputtered, sorry at once for the question. "Well, you're cured then. They released you." I was so relieved to see him that I grasped his arm and pulled him inside, feeling that he was the only person in the world to whom I could talk. Granting he was sane, of course. "I am as sane as you are," he said, as if reading my mind. "And that's a loaded statement." "Is it?" I answered, thinking, if he only knew how loaded. "In any case, I felt that you wanted to see me," he said, now ensconced in the wicker chair that literally groaned beneath his weight. "Actually, I'm as sane as the doctors are, which isn't saying much. Or rather, I'm saner, which places me in a particular situation." He was joking, in excellent spirits, but I said uncomfortably, "Saner than sane? That sounds suspicious." "Can't tell if I'm sane or not, huh? That puts you in a particular position, for which I apologize. So since I'm here, in your territory, we'll play it your way. You can assure yourself that I'm sane, using your own definition of the word, presuming you know what you mean by it, of course. Now, since my glass is empty, I'd like to suggest that you offer me a drink. Oh, sorry, of course. I made us each one, leaving the liquor bottle out on the table. "So, I've been given a clean bill of mental health," he said. "I'm more relieved than I can say," I said, meaning it. "I know you are," he said, and I had the curious impression that his words were double-edged, or that he knew more than he was letting on. But about what? Or was his attitude simply a hangover of his condition, a sly reminder of psychological duplicity? "How is Queen Alice?" I asked. protesting. "Fine, as well as can be expected," he answered, which told me nothing, of course. "But you've been writing a report or thesis or book of sorts, haven't you?" he asked. I stared at him. He looked no different. He didn't act as if he realized he was talking about something he had no way of knowing was true. "What's the matter? Secret, huh? Well, I've heard your typewriter going up here for hours at a time from my rooms below. Not complaining, you understand, but I took it for granted that you're working on a manuscript of some sort." The terrible nervousness that had assaulted me the moment he first mentioned a book subsided so quickly that I was giddy. Of course I thought he'd been in his apartment downstairs, not at the sanatorium. It would have been odd if he hadn't heard the typewriter, since you could hear a sneeze in this building 2 floors away. "Beginning a thesis," I said, probably too quickly. "I suppose it could run into a book." "Excellent, excellent, yes. Our boy is catching up," Ram said, rubbing his pudgy hands together. I caught the third-person reference to myself uneasily, then remembered that this was his habit of speech, not only with me but with others. It was apparent that I'd been overreacting, and with new relief I poured myself another drink, though Ram was still sipping his. "Anyhow, I'm delighted that you've been given a clean bill of health," I said. "Do you have to go back for any kind of follow-up?" "I have to go back to keep track of our Queen Alice," Ram said, shifting in the chair. This time the wicker creaked. Okay. Oh boy. This time the wicker creaked more. I can just see it. Okay. This time the wicker creaked more warningly than ever. I don't know if I can read this sentence. It's crazy. Okay. And Ram grinned. This time the wicker creaked more warningly than ever, and Ram grinned. "Take the blue chair instead," I said quickly. "I've got to throw the wicker one away anyhow." "Go ahead. The blue one is much more comfortable. I'll even stick the wicker out in the hall while I'm thinking about it." And as Ram moved, taking his drink, pack of cigarettes, and ashtray with him, I stuck the old chair just outside the door, planning to cart it down to the trash heap later. Ram crossed his legs and made himself generally comfortable, this time on the couch. "Yes, I want to keep an eye on Queen Alice," he said. Then, looking at me speculatively, "I see that you don't want to tell me what you've been up to, though. Well, that's easily understandable. But right now I'm giving you a demonstration of sorts that you won't understand until I'm gone." "Now what does that mean?" I asked. "You're a good psychologist. You'll figure it out," Ram answered. "I'm delighted with our little chat, though. Yes. Our boy is doing fine." He stood up, rubbing his hands together in a quick, nervous, yet almost smug gesture, and grinned like a Cheshire cat, and disappeared. He disappeared. I stood there, not believing my eyes. He was gone. Suddenly I felt woozy. Spun around, or thought that I did, and found myself sitting at my desk, head slumped over on it, resting on my arms. Ram definitely was not in the room. The only conclusion that I could rationally draw was that I had fallen asleep after he left, and dreamed that he disappeared. Then, why didn't I remember him leaving? I reached for my drink. It wasn't there. My gaze flew about the room. There were no used glasses on the end tables. There was no bottle of liquor either. I rushed into the kitchen and to my amazement found the bottle in the cupboard with no indication it had been moved. Nearly beside myself, I walked as calmly as I could back to the living room. The wicker chair sat there where it always had. This time I poured myself a real drink and sat down to collect my thoughts. Ram hadn't been here at all. I hadn't moved the wicker chair into the hall. The entire episode had been a dream then, I decided. As soon as I finished my notes, I must have fallen asleep, and my concern about Ram and my need to talk to someone must have triggered. My thoughts broke off. The dream explanation just wouldn't do. The entire interview had been too clear. I began to think that despite everything, in some way, Ram had been here. Had I moved the chair in the same unknown fashion? Was Ram actually still in the hospital? I tried not to ask the next question, but could not avoid it. Had Ram been here in an out-of-body state? He couldn't have heard the typewriter if he wasn't home. So how did he know about the manuscript? Or, impossible as it seemed, was the affair all my own creation? Not a dream, but a complete hallucination. If so, I was in trouble. Again, I worried for my own sanity. But I was actually too angry. Healthily angry, I thought. To think I was mad. I had seen Ram. Now I refused to doubt my own perception. And I hate practical jokers. So if Ram had played some kind of psychological or psychic trick on me, I was going to get to the bottom of it. In other words, I decided to go over to the sanatorium later that very afternoon. In Chapter 16, Peace, Light, and Love. Aloha.